something we cannot do with just HTML and CSS, and therefore we need JavaScript to run our more complex logic. Now that we implemented this first example, this first demo, I want to introduce another new concept which is not related to the DOM, but which is important in JavaScript in general, which is a bit more advanced, and which therefore fits perfectly into this section as well. And this concept is about variables and a variation of those variables called constants. Now, we did learn about variables already in the last course section, and we saw plenty of examples for variables in action. Just in case you forgot it, variables are these labeled data containers which we use to store data so that we can then use one and the same data in different parts of our code, possibly also multiple times. Now, variables are called variables because we can change the value stored in a variable. We can overwrite the value stored in a variable with a new one. If I created a variable with the let keyword, then I can overwrite the value stored in that variable with a brand new value if I want to. And therefore, thus far in this course, where we only learned about these kinds of variables, we only worked with such true variables, which could really change. Now, often in development, though, you also deal with so-called constant value. Use. So values which you store in a variable once, but which you then never change. So variables where the value actually never changes are called constants. And therefore the name variable is a bit strange because they're not really variable, but variable is a general term in programming describing these data containers, and therefore in JavaScript we also call constants variables. Now constants are created with the const keyword, and up to this point we haven't seen them yet. We haven't worked with them yet, and that's going to change, and therefore I'll now show you why we might want to use constants in certain scenarios and how we use them. Now, what's the idea behind constants? First of all, it's an alternative to using the let keyword and to create a variable that can be changed. But the idea is simple. Sometimes you have variables, data containers, that contain a value which you actually never replace with a new value. So you might have some entered username, which you fetched from some input field, and maybe that never changes once you fetched it. So once the form was submitted, maybe. In that case, you can store it in a variable, but you can also mark it as a const with that const keyword to make it very clear to you and to other developers that this variable will actually never hold any other value than the one that was initially assigned. And if you would try to assign another value, as you're seeing it here in this little demo snippet I prepared, then you would get an error if this code would be executed, because you would be violating your own rules or your own rule, which says that this variable, username, must not be overwritten with a new value. And that can add extra code safety and ensure that the code is not changed in a way that breaks your program. That might not matter too much in small demos or small projects, but in bigger projects and bigger scripts, where maybe multiple developers are working on the same code, this can add extra safety, which avoids unwanted errors. And because of that, it is typically considered a good practice as a developer to be explicit in cases where you can be explicit about your intentions of your code. And if you know that some variable will never hold any other value than the initial value, whilst you can keep it as a variable, it is a good idea to turn it into a constant instead to make that very clear, that this variable will never receive a new value. And we can apply this to this demo project we worked on thus far. If we have a look at our demo code here, there is indeed one thing you maybe recognize or see. And that's the fact that all the variables I am creating here never change. None of these variables change. I create two variables here, and I assign values initially, and then I never assign a new value thereafter. And the same is true for all other variables. And therefore we can, and that's important, we don't have to, but we can turn them all into constants by replacing let with const. And the advantage we get from that is that we make it clear that these values should never change. So that's what we can do. And I did... And then because of that, it is typically considered a good practice as a developer to be explicit in cases where you can be explicit about your intentions of your code. And if you know that some variable will never hold any other value than the initial value, whilst you can keep it as a variable, it is a good idea to turn it into a constant instead to make that very clear, that this variable will never receive a new value. And we can apply this to this demo project we worked on thus far. If we have a look at our demo code here, there is indeed one thing you maybe recognize or see. And that's the fact that all the variables I am creating here never change. None of these variables change. I create two variables here, and I assign values initially, and then I never assign a new value thereafter. And the same is true for all other variables. And therefore we can, and that's important, we don't have to, but we can turn them all into constants by replacing let with const. And the advantage we get from that is that we make it clear that these values should never change. So that's what we can do. And I did mention at the beginning of this course section that as a developer, we sometimes want to be very strict, and we want to ensure that our code is not getting used incorrectly, either by us or by other developers. And here I actually have a good example for this, why it might be a good idea to use a couple of constants here. Take these element variables, or constants now, up there. Actually, these variables, as they were before, should never receive new values, because our other code relies on the fact that in this product name input element, we have that input element as a value, because we want to add an event listener to that, and because we, for example, want to extract the max length from that. So if we would leave that as a variable, we theoretically could write code where we overwrite the value stored in this variable with a different value, maybe with a different HTML element, and all of a sudden our other code that depends on this being the initial value, the product name input field, would none of these variables change. I create two variables here, and I assign values initially, and then I never assign a new value thereafter. The same is true for all other variables. And therefore we can, and that's important, we don't have to, but we can turn them all into constants by replacing let with const. And the advantage we get from that is that we make it clear that these values should never change. So that's what we can do. And I did mention at the beginning of this course section that as a developer, we sometimes want to be very strict and we want to ensure that our code is not getting used incorrectly, either by us or by other developers. And here I actually have a good example for this, why it might be a good idea to use a couple of constants here. Take these element variables, or constants now, up there. Actually, these variables, as they were before, should never receive new values.
Element variables.
Because our other code relies on the fact that in this product name input element, we have that input element as a value because we want to add an event listener to that and because we, for example, want to extract the max length from that. Input element we have up there. Actually, these variables, as they were before, should never receive new values because our other code relies on the fact that in this product name input element, we have that input element as a value because we want to add an event listener to that and because we, for example, want to extract the max length from that. Incorrectly, either by us or by other developers. And here I actually have a good example for this, why it might be a good idea to use a couple of constants here. Take these element variables, or constants now, up there. Actually, these variables, as they were before, should never receive new values because our other code relies on the fact that in this product name input element, we have that input element as a value because we want to add an event listener to that and because we, for example, want to extract the max length from an event. We base on the fact that in this product name input element, we have that input element as a value because we want to add an event listener to that and because we,
Will only add the event listener to the correct element if they assume all object store and product name is still an input, so is look different.
for example, want to extract the max length from them.
Will only extract the max length correctly if they assume only extract the max length correctly if the HC or null object stored in product name input element still is the input element that initially stored in one.
at. So if we would leave that as a variable, we theoretically could write code where we overwrite the
Okay, so this is the label. Product name dot max length. Fucks me up. It's not even spelled this out. So now this function event from the event listener takes the input is the enter text the length of the enter text remaining characters okay, and then max allowed characters minus enter text length. This variable right here. Variable with this method, right? It's a method. Equals remaining characters. I think I get it now.
value stored in this variable with a different value, maybe with a different HTML element, and all of a sudden our other code that depends on this being the initial value, the product name input field, would break. And of course, that is kind of a made-up scenario here, because this is a very short and simple script, and we are the only developer working on this. But as you get more experienced, and as you start building more complex websites, it will not be unusual that you have longer scripts, and that you maybe work on them in a team. And if you then start overriding some variable that one of your colleagues needs with a different value, because you think it doesn't matter, for example, all of a sudden some other code breaks. That's why it's optional here in the end, because this is simple, but why it generally is considered a good practice to use constants if you can be that explicit and if you never plan on changing that value, because then you can lock that in and ensure that it never changes. But when I do that, there are a couple of parts in the code that could be confusing. For example, I'm creating constants here in this function, but wait a second, can't this function execute more than once? It executes for every keystroke, so technically these variables do change with every keystroke, right? Well, not really. This function executes with every keystroke, that is correct, but once it's done executing, all the variables that were created during the execution and that are stored in memory, because that is where the variables are stored, they are stored in your computer memory, all those variables are thrown away. Not what you see on the page, and not any changes that were maybe made by your function, but the variables which are stored in memory are thrown away and deleted once this execution finishes. That means that when the function executes the next time for another keystroke, brand new variables are created. Yes, they have the same name as before, but they occupy new parts of your computer memory, because the old ones were deleted. So technically, we don't change existing variables, we always create new ones. And therefore, during the function execution, they are constant because thereafter they are deleted. They are never overwritten. Now, another confusing thing could be that we do change some of the elements that are stored in constants. For example, on remaining char's element, which is this constant here, I am changing the text content. Or on product name input element, I am adding an event listener. So clearly I am changing the objects stored in these constants. And that is correct. I am changing these objects, I am changing these DOM elements, for example, but I'm still not changing the constants, the data containers. It is super important to understand that the value stored in a constant, in this case here, is the entire HTML element object. In this case, the object representing the input. Now, I would only change the constant itself if I reassign a value with an equal sign, not to some property of the object, but to the constant itself. So if I would return the entire stance, for example, but I'm still not changing the constants, the data containers. It is super important to understand that the value stored in a constant, in this case here, is the entire HTML element object. In this case, the object representing the input. Now, I would only change the constant itself if I reassign a value with an equal sign, not to some property of the object, but to the constant itself. So if I would reach out to my remaining char's element and I tried assigning a new value like this, then I would try to change the constant. If I instead change the value of some property in there, then the constant stays the same. It's just the object stored in the constant where some of its property. I am changing the text content. Or on product name input element, I am adding an event listener. So clearly I am changing the objects stored in these constants. And that is correct. I am changing these objects, I am changing these DOM elements, for example, but I'm still not changing the constants, the data containers. It is super important to understand that the value stored in a constant, in this case here, is the entire HTML element object. In this case, the object representing the input. Now, I would only change the constant itself if I reassign a value with an equal sign, not to some property of the object, but to the constant itself. So if I would reach out to my remaining char's element and I tried assigning a new value like this, then I would try to change the constant. If I instead change the value of some property in there, then the constant stays the same. It's just the object stored in the constant where some of its properties change. The object itself is the same as before, just some of its properties changed, but the object stored in the constant, and therefore the value of the constant itself overall was not overwritten. And that can definitely be confusing, but it's essentially just important to keep in mind that values inside of an object are just that, values in an object, not the value stored directly in a constant. The value stored in a constant is just the object. And as long as we don't override that with a brand new object, and we try to assign a new value to that constant with the equal character again, as long as we don't do that, the constant didn't change. If that's still a bit confusing, it is something that will become clearer with more practice and the deeper you dive into JavaScript. Here, we are still only scratching the surface, we are still only getting started with it. Nonetheless, I wanted to touch on this concept and I wanted to bring back constants because it is quite common to use as many constants as possible to make it very clear whether some variable in your code will eventually be overwritten with a new value or whether it is constant and does never change. Now, this demo on which we work here is generally working. The character count here is updating. But if you compare this to the demo I showed you earlier in this course, where I showed you what we would be building, then you see that one important feature is missing here. as I type more and more characters, if we go below 10 remaining characters, in the demo I showed you, the color here did change and the background color of the input field changed. And that's not happening here. Now we need 2 additional building blocks to make this work. The first building block is that we need to learn how we can manipulate our DOM elements such that they do change color, so how we can change the styling of DOM elements with JavaScript. And then in a second step, we will need to find out how to do that conditionally. And let's start with the first step. Let's learn how we can change the color of DOM elements. And for this, I'll actually stay on this page here and open my developer tools, because we learned that here in these tools, we can also execute some JavaScript code. Here we can also run simple snippets, and I can, for example, use the document object to also select an element here. And we can even store that selected element in a constant or a variable then. And I'll do that so that we can play around with it here. And let's say I want to start with this span here. Now for that, keep in mind, if I select it, that this has an
Holy shit. Okay. Yeah, this makes so much sense.
idea of remaining chars. So in this console here, I'll get my span element. By writing document get element by ID.
I have have to remember that we get element by ID.
And then the ID I'm looking for here is remaining chars. Like this. If I now hit enter, this span element is this span which I selected here. An element is, now hit enter, this span element is this span which I selected here. We can, by the way, log something here in this console by just typing the variable name. This will not work in your other JavaScript code. There, if you just type a variable name, this will not log it to the console. But here in this console of the developer tools, that is what will happen. So here we can log something like that. So if I got my span element here, and I did recreate this constant here because this page reloaded, because I changed my JavaScript code, then we can use this span element to do things with it. And for example, we did learn that we can set the text content to some new text. Like 59, for example, like this. Now, this updated here on the page. But we can also not just change the text content, but as we saw it before at the example of the anchor element, we can also change other properties of our DOM elements. For example, on the anchor, we changed the href property to change the target destination. And on basically all HTML elements, we can access a style property, which allows us to change the styling of that element, or to set styles as we would set them with the style attribute in HTML. So here I can access style, and then what's stored in this style property of a DOM element is actually a nested object with more properties. Hence we can add another dot here to dive into those nested properties. And what we find here are now basically equivalents to the different CSS properties we learned about. For example, there is a text align property. And of course, there is a text align CSS property. The main difference, which is important to note though, is that they are written differently. In CSS, we would have text-align, all lowercase. In JavaScript, the equivalent is the same word or combination of words, but without a dash, instead using this camel case notation, which we learned is the main convention for naming things in JavaScript. And this convention is used here because dashes are not allowed in variable or property names. So text-align would be invalid JavaScript code, and that's why it's named text-align written like this. But the interesting thing is that we can set this to the same values we can assign to the CSS property text align. So here we could use center or left as a string though. In CSS, it would just be center or left as keywords, but that's because CSS is a different programming language. In JavaScript, if you would just write left or center like that, JavaScript would look for variables or built-in commands, functions with such names. That's why we need to turn this into a string instead. Now, text align actually is a property which wouldn't have a real effect on this span, and therefore let's use a different property, and let's maybe use color, which we can use to set the color. We can set color to any value that would be expected in CSS, again with the limitation that it should be a string. So here, for example, we could set it to red, or to a hex code, or to RGB, and then maybe 0, 120, 50. And if I now hit enter, this changed to a green, color. And if I inspect this span again, indeed we see that this style attribute was added now, and that it has this style set. And that's what we can do with JavaScript as well. We can also change the style attribute and then the different CSS properties that can be changed, like color, like text align, like background color, and so on. And as so often, feel free to play around with it. Just keep in mind that it's this camel case notation and that your values should be strings. So for example, if we want to change the font size, we could simply write 30 pixels like this as a string, and then this would get bigger. Now that's one way of changing the styling. And of course, since I'm just doing this here in this console in the DevTools, whenever I reload the page, all these changes are gone. If we would write it in this JavaScript code here, of course, they would persist since it would be updated on the running page by the code that is part of this page. But now we covered this. There is another way of changing the styling or the look of our elements. The alternative way of using this style property and then its nested properties would be that we maybe want to set certain CSS classes on elements. And indeed, I prepared some classes here. In styles CSS, you will see, if you scroll through that file, that there is this warning class. Which I actually use in conjunction with the input element. And since there is no space in between, this means that I want to select all input elements that have the warning class applied to them. Whereas if we had a blank in between, this would mean that I want to select all the elements that have a warning class that are child or descendant elements of input. So here I have it without a blank, which means all inputs that have a warning class added to them. And the same for remaining chars. The element with the remaining char's ID should receive this color if it also has the warning CSS class. And out of the box, this warning CSS class is not added. Be able to apply the styles configured for this class whenever that class is added with JavaScript. And that's something we can also do here. For this, I'll again use my span element, and for this I'll quickly reselect it, since this page updated. For that I just wrote const span, and then if I press the up arrow, it shows me previously used commands or code lines, and I can just autocomplete them by hitting tab then to save some time, and then hit enter to execute it. Now, you only need to do that if the page reloaded, because then that span element constant, which was stored in memory, would be lost otherwise. Now we do have it back, and now to change the CSS classes on that element, we got two main ways of doing that. We do have the class name property. So not class, but class name. The reason is that class actually is a reserved word in JavaScript. We haven't used it yet, but it is a reserved word fulfilling a certain purpose, and therefore this property has class name as a name. And class name then can be set equal to a string value, which is basically the value for the class attribute that will be set on that element. So that could be first dash class, second dash class. Here, using a dash is no problem since we're inside of a string. And if I set this, then, for example, we would see that on this span, these classes were added. So whatever you set as a value for class name will be added as the class attribute on that element for which you are setting it. And that's one way of setting classes. And of course, therefore, we could set it to a different string where we don't say first class, second class, but instead warning. Now I would overwrite my classes on that element with that new class string, in this case with only one class, therefore. And if I hit enter, you'll notice that this got orange. Because if we inspect this again, we now see that class is set to warning, and first class and second class were overwritten, therefore. And that then in turn has this effect that this CSS rule is becoming active and is applying this color to this element. That's this CSS rule, which I showed you a couple of seconds ago, this one here. And that's one way of setting CSS classes with JavaScript. This approach is often great, but it has a disadvantage. If you are doing this on an element that already has a class, which is not the case here, but if you already had a class on that element, let's say this span here already had a class attribute with some class, which is redundant here, but let's say we had this class for some reason already, then whenever you do override it, so if I reselect my span element here, and I then override class name with warning, then this warning class would be applied, but we see the old class, some class, is missing now. It was overwritten. And that might sometimes be what you want, but sometimes it's also not what you want. Now, the solution for this would be that you set class name equal to warning, and then the class which you want to persist, so which you don't want to lose. But that, of course, means that you always need to remember which classes are already on that element, or you always need to write some extra code that looks at the element, extracts the existing classes, and then appends a new class. And that gets even more annoying if you then want to remove a class, because then you have to overwrite the existing string of class names with a new string, which is all the old class names minus the one you want to remove. It's all doable, but it can be annoying. That's why, in addition to class name, we also have the class list property. And class list actually is an object with a couple of utility methods that make managing classes on HTML elements easy. For example, you have an add method, which you can execute like this, to which you pass a string which contains the class name or class names which you want to add, like warning. And now that will add this. And we also have a remove method which removes the class name which you're passing here, and only that class, no other class names. So here with that, if you now inspect this again, after executing remove, you see this is gone. And if I would reload this entire page so that some class is set, since this is set initially here, if I now would get access to my span element again, if I then first of all execute class list add warning like this, then if we inspect this again, we see that some class is still there, but in addition warning was added. And if I go back and I remove warning, so if I change add to remove here and execute this, then, hopefully unsurprisingly, we see that some class is still there and warning was removed. And therefore, you can also change classes besides those styles with the style attribute, either by using class name to override the class attribute, or class list to manage it in a more elegant way. And often class list, of course, is the better choice, since you have more fine-grained control over what's going on. And that's how you can change styling of elements. And of course, not just of span elements, but of any elements that you can style with CSS. Now that's also the conjunction of CSS and JavaScript, and we see how these two languages work together with help of style and of these class properties. Now let's move on to the conditional part. Because now that we know how we can add and remove the warning class, we of course want to do that conditionally based on the amount of characters the user entered. We only want to do that if there are less than 10 remaining characters. Now I got another upcoming exercise for you, but before we go there and apply what we learned, I want to summarize what you learned in this module up to this point. And of course, the main topic of this section up to this point is how you can work with the DOM. And maybe let's even take a step back from that. What was the DOM again? Well, the DOM in the end is just the parsed HTML code. The browser parses the HTML code so that it knows what it should show on the screen, and it stores basically a bunch of JavaScript objects that represent the parsed HTML code internally, which it then certainly also uses internally, for example, to bring this onto the screen, but which it also provides to you as a developer so that through JavaScript, and to be precise, through this document variable, which is globally available, you can access that DOM. Now, document, as you learned, stores an object with a bunch of properties, where most of these properties then store more nested objects, so that you can actually drill into that DOM and access the different HTML elements that live inside of it. Now, since drilling into the DOM like this is possible but can be cumbersome, we also learned about utility methods which exist, like query selector or get element by ID. It is worth mentioning that these are not all the available methods. There also are methods for getting elements by tag name and so on, and there also is query selector all to select more than one element. But these two methods are definitely two of the most important and common methods for searching for specific elements in the DOM. Now, once you got hold of an element, you can output it to look into it, but that's typically not too useful to the visitors of your site, and therefore you can also manipulate those elements. For example, you can set the ref attribute, the ref property, and therefore the attribute of that element through JavaScript to change the link destination. As you saw before, you can also change styles or the text content of elements through those different properties that exist on those elements. And here, indeed, it is a good idea to consult their elements to find out which properties and methods are available there. Now, you cannot just select and edit existing elements. You also learned that you can add new elements and insert them into the page, into the DOM, that you can remove elements, and that you can also move elements around without deleting them, so just moving them into a new position on the page. And that's all also sometimes useful, and sometimes these are features which you also need to add a certain feature to your page or achieve a certain behavior. Of course, as mentioned before, we are going to see more examples for that throughout this course. Now, in addition to selecting and manipulating elements, you can also add event listeners with that add event listener method, which you can call on all those elements. And then there's a broad variety of built-in events, like the input event or the click event, which we also saw before, to which you can listen to then tell the browser to execute a certain function at some point in the future when that event occurs. And in that function, you can then execute any code you want to execute once that event occurred. Now, in that function, which is executed by add event listener eventually, you also get such an event object as a first parameter automatically by the browser. And you learned that this event object holds various pieces of information about the event that occurred. For example, also the event target, which is the element on which we clicked or on which the input event occurred. And that then allows you to get data from that element, for example, as we're doing it here in this demo.js file. So these are all extremely important and useful features which you will often need. We also learned about this const keyword, which you can use instead of let if you have a variable where you indeed never assign a new value to with help of the equal sign. If you never assign a new value to a variable, and really only to the variable itself, not to some nested property, that does not matter. But if you never assign a new value to a variable, you can turn it into a const to be more explicit about the fact that this is a variable that does never change and that should maybe never change. So that's another keyword I introduced in this section. And with that, you already learned a lot about how to work with the DOM and how to manipulate it. And therefore, next up, I'll give you a chance of practicing what you learned before we then explore control structures as a next step. So it's time to, again, practice what you learned. And therefore, attached you find this exercise 2 zip file, which contains 3 files, which you can simply add in a subfolder to your project, as I did it here. So simply add that extracted folder to your project folder, for example, by simply dragging and dropping it here into Visual Studio Code, or by opening this project in the Windows Explorer or Mac Finder and adding the extracted folder there. And now in that folder, as you can see, I got a HTML, a JavaScript, and a CSS file. The CSS file just has some basic styles for a button, for a section, and the index.html file just has a basic skeleton and then a bit of text, a couple of paragraphs, and a couple of buttons in there. Now, you can simply open this with the live server extension again, and once you did that, you will see this here on the page. That's the content I prepared for you. And out of the box, these buttons don't do anything, by the way. They just sit there, but they don't do anything. Please note that these buttons are also not part of a form, because here we will not use them for submitting or validating any user input, but instead I want to use these buttons to trigger some non-form related actions. Now, which actions should be triggered is actually described in this text, but also in the exercise.js file. In there, you won't see any JavaScript code yet. Instead, you only find the written instructions. And here's what I want you to do in the next minutes, and in the lecture thereafter, we are, of course, going to solve this together, so that you also see my solution, and you can compare yours to mine. Now, what I want you to do is I want you to select the 2 button elements, which you find in this index.html file. So these 2 buttons, you should select them and store them in 2 different variables. And I'm calling it variables here, but of course you can also consider using constants here if the values never change. Now, you should actually select the first button without adding or using any ID to it. So you will need to find a different way of selecting the button. And you should select the second button by using an ID. So by adding some ID to this button, it doesn't have one yet, you will have to add one, and then you should select that button with help of that ID, and then store it in a variable. That's task number 1. Now in task number 2, you should use these buttons to add click event listeners to the buttons. And those 2 click event listeners which you add should trigger 2 different functions. So you need 2 functions, 2 different functions that should be triggered. And for the moment, both functions should output console.dir, the clicked button elements, but the first function for the first button to which you added a listener should actually output that button with help of that variable which you created in task 1. The second button and the event listener attached to that button should actually output that button without using that variable. So you'll have to find a different way of getting access to the clicked button. In task number 3, I then want you to also select and store the paragraphs mentioned in the text. So if you read the text, you see that that will be this paragraph and the first paragraph. I also repeat it here. You should select these 2 paragraphs and store them in variables as well. But here I want you to select both paragraphs by drilling into the document. So not with query selector or anything like that, but with help of drilling. And you should then simply find a way of selecting these 2 different paragraphs and storing them in variables. And if you struggle with that, then you can fall back to using these utility methods, but definitely try to select them with drilling. Once you completed task 3, in task 4, I want you to change the functions that you created in task 2, which currently only output the click buttons, such that the first button, so this button here, actually removes this paragraph when it's clicked. So you should find a way of doing that. And the second button, so this here, of course, should actually change this first paragraph such that it adds a blue background color to it. That's what these buttons should do once task 4 is completed. Now in task number 5, I want you to repeat for, or this second part of for to be precise, but instead of changing the inline styles of that paragraph, you should now try to add a blue background by adding a CSS class to that paragraph once the button is clicked. Now here's an important note, you'll have to add the CSS class too, because in style CSS there currently is no predefined class that would do that. And that's it. These are my tasks for you. Definitely try them on your own first. In the next lecture, we'll do them together.